I'm Kara. I work with Kentuckians for Energy Democracy. We're a statewide coalition
Wide coalition.
working at the intersection of energy affordability, utility accountability, and the transition to clean, safe, reliable, and resilient energy system. This is our third webinar in our expert regulatory webinar series. And we're really excited to have some folks here to talk with us about rate making and best practices for making sure that rate making is affordable for folks. And so wanted to welcome Janelle Wilson from RMI and Carmen Bingham from the Virginia Poverty Law Center. Um, Janelle Wilson is a manager at RMI, specializing in the regulation of electricity utilities. Janelle focuses on reforming utility regulation to align utilities' financial incentives with the goal of fostering a swift, affordable, and reliable energy transition. Janelle provides support across the U.S. to utility commissions, consumer advocates, and other actors engaged in the regulatory space to identify, design, and implement context-appropriate regulatory reforms that will support these outcomes. Prior to RMI, Janelle worked for the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University. And we have Carmen Bingham. Carmen M. Bingham is the program coordinator for the Affordable Clean Energy Program at the Virginia Poverty Law Center, headquartered in Richmond, Virginia. In this role, Carmen collaborates with utility providers and various stakeholders to develop and implement impactful energy efficiency policies and initiatives aimed at reducing energy usage and cost for low to moderate income households. A notable achievement in reducing energy costs for low income households was the development of the first percentage of income payment plan, or PIP, for customers of Virginia's two investor-owned electric utility providers. This program, championed by VPLC, was successfully integrated into Virginia's landmark Clean Economy Act legislation in 2020. Recognized for her expertise in clean energy advocacy, Carmen was appointed to Virginia's Clean Energy Advisory Board in 2021, which was created to develop programs that provide direct access to solar energy to low to moderate income households in Virginia. Carmen has attended NARUC Utility Rate School and Michigan State's IPU, Institute of Public Utilities Accounting and Rate Making course. Before her tenure at VPLC, Carmen served as the Chief of Staff for the Honorable David Toscano of Charlottesville, the former House Democratic Caucus leader, where she worked to shape Virginia's policy and legislative code on issues related to energy, transportation, and education. And I know that you all are as excited as I am to hear what these amazing experts have to say. So, with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Janelle.
Thank you so much, Kara, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for thank you for to Kentuckians for Energy Democracy for inviting me here to speak with you all today. I'm going to start by giving a overview of some of the rate making basics and then the opportunities to reform rate making to support the outcome of affordability in particular. So, Kara already introduced me. I'm a manager on the electricity team, Janelle Wilson. But who is RMI? If you're not familiar with RMI, we're an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit organization working to transform the global energy system through market-driven solutions that support clean, prosperous, and zero carbon future for all. So, what am I going to cover today? I'm going to touch on some of the basics of rate making, and then I'm going to talk about some of the emerging challenges that we're seeing in the last couple of years and we're projecting for the years ahead. And then talk about the opportunities to implement reform to tackle some of those challenges and advance affordability. So without further ado, I'm going to start us off with some basics about rate making. So because utilities are regulated entities, they don't just decide what their revenue model is going to be in a vacuum. The regulatory framework that they operate in dictates their business model and can also be influenced by policy mandates in the state or wholesale market rules in the service territory that they're operating in, and some other factors as well. Um, and rate making is both a product of, as well as a driver of all of the utilities decision making across the spheres of planning for the future, designing rates, and their day-to-day operations. So when you think about the rate making process generally, there are three very basic elemental steps. One is first thinking about the revenue requirement. And I like to think about this by thinking about the metaphor of a pie, right? So when we think about the revenue requirement, we are determining the total size of the pie that can be recovered from ratepayers. The second step is allocation. So that is thinking about how the pie is going to be split up and the pieces of the pie that will be doled out to different customer classes. And then rate design is what is the process of determining the rate structure that will allow the utility to recover each portion of the pie from each customer class. So we're going to be spending most of our time today talking about step one and reforms that support like reducing the overall size of the pie. We'll also be talking a little bit about some reforms that really target addressing customers who are, from a rate design and customer allocation perspective, customers who are most vulnerable right now to increasing cost. So when you think about determining the overall size of the pie, there's the traditional cost of service formula, in which the approved capital expenditures are added to the rate base and then multiplied by a rate of return. So these are the first two elements in this formula here. And then operating expenditures are totally passed through to ratepayers without a rate of return, which means that CapEx provides an opportunity for utility earnings, whereas OpEx does not. That formula results in several incentives, which are then misaligned with the goal of affordability. So I'm going to talk through each of these incentives really quickly. The first is CapEx bias, which is simply the utility's preference for investing in capital solutions over OpEx solutions, which in some cases may be less expensive alternatives to a capital solution. Gold plating refers to the incentive to spend more on capital investments than might be otherwise necessary in order to increase shareholder earnings. The throughput incentive is the motivation to increase sales of megawatt hours, in this case for electric utilities, in order to increase utility revenues. So the more they sell, the more revenue they can recover from ratepayers. And many cost-effective resources like energy efficiency, demand flexibility, when they are effective, they erode the utility's revenues. Similarly, customer-owned resources and third-party service providers undermine the utility's opportunities for earning, which traditionally make utilities hostile to distributed resources and innovative business models that might rely on customer-sited, customer-owned, and third-party services. So that's the bit about rate making. Now we're going to turn our focus to examining what's going on across the country. What are some of the recent trends? I'm going to talk about a few different trends that roughly level up to trends that are increasing cost and energy burdens. And there are trends in terms of how these misalignments in the utilities incentives are manifesting in higher costs. So this map shows rates between 2010 and 2023 on a constant basis, meaning adjusted for inflation. What you'll notice is that across the country, rates went down in most states. In Kentucky, there's an exception to that rule. Kentucky rates increased moderately by 6%. And so it's important to understand in understanding this graph is that while rates went up only slightly in constant dollars, this is a long period of time that's reflected here in this map. And people don't typically adjust for inflation in their memory when they are thinking about rates over time. So the sense that rates are going up quickly can feel very real. This map is a different one, but shows changes in residential electricity bills. Broadly across the country, bills have decreased in most states since 2010. And in Kentucky, this is true in Kentucky as well, where bills on average reduced by 16%. So chances are that if you're living in a house where rates have gone up and you still live in the same house, for over this entire period of time, you're probably consuming the same amount of energy in 2023 as you did back in 2010. And so your bills have probably gone up. But the reality is changes in housing stock and energy efficiency and appliance standards and other general changes in consumption may have resulted in bills, or at least the average of bills, going down. But this trend is an average, which hides the fact that across the country, nearly 1 in 3 households nationwide reported experiencing a form of energy insecurity in the past year. And energy insecurity simply means the inability of a household to meet its basic household energy needs. So 34% of households, 1 in 3 households, forewent expenses such as food or healthcare in order to pay their energy bill. And 1 in 5 households, 22%, left their home at unsafe or unhealthy temperatures. And then another 23% of people identified as having been unable to pay their energy bill in full. So let's take a look at what this looks like in Kentucky specifically. Using data from the U.S. Department of Energy LEAD tool and looking at 2022, in 2022, low-income households in Kentucky spent 4x more on their energy, more of their income on energy than compared to non-low income customers. So the average energy burden in Kentucky is 3% for all customers, but low income households spend 13% on average on their energy bills. That's higher than the national average for low income households, which is around 10%. And this average hides the fact that even the lowest income households, so those people who are earning less than 100% of the federal poverty limit, have an average energy burden in Kentucky of 20%, meaning 1/5 of their total income is being spent on energy.
Hmm.
So, how does Kentucky stack up to the rest of the country? Well, I took a look at a resource that RMI has recently published. Across the country, Kentucky is 20th in terms of the dollar per household of monthly electric bills. You're 43rd in the country in terms of electricity rates, so among the states with the lowest electricity rates, but still in the top 50% of states with high electric bills. And then in terms of energy burden, average energy burden, Kentucky is towards the top of the list of states, so ninth in terms of the percent of average household income spent on energy. So what does this mean in terms of ratepayers' ability to stay and remain connected, to stay on top of their bills? Well, we don't have fantastic data across the country for disconnection, but it's an area where we're increasing our understanding over time. But what we do know suggests that the rate of disconnection increased again after the pandemic. And in Kentucky, the rate of disconnections for Kentucky utilities was definitely the highest. This is data for 2019 through 2022. But Louisville Gas and Electric, Kentucky Power, and Columbia Gas were definitely neck and neck for that second place spot in terms of the average rate of disconnection of customers for that period of time. Unfortunately, we don't have more recent data at this moment. So what is contributing to the affordability challenge? Why is this such an issue? Well, I think there's several factors that are at play and working together. The first is sources of cost, right? So we think about there are definitely needs to increase investment in certain areas of the energy sector, right? Transmission and distribution costs. We'll talk about that in a little bit more. So there's costs associated with extreme weather events. And then those sources of cost at play with some of the macroeconomic factors that are happening externally, such as the projection for load growth, right? That's where we're anticipating will increase the amount of electricity need or demand across the country, as well as things like supply chain challenges and inflation and tariffs. And then the third component that's at play here is what I was talking about earlier, those exacerbated, perverse incentives that are making the sources of cost and those macroeconomic factors even worse. So we start first with thinking about like the load growth challenge, right? Projected load from data centers, US manufacturing, and electrification across sectors is likely to increase domestic energy consumption between 3 to 5%. And Kentucky, I just want to note here, is at the intersection of two of the regions, PJM and MISO, that are anticipating some of the largest load growth by the end of the decade. So if you're interested in load growth and what can be done to specifically tackle this issue, I want to encourage you to think about watching the recording from the last workshop in which my colleague Jeff and John Wilson from Grid Strategies talked about some solutions to tackling the load growth challenge. We think about the sources of cost. I mentioned that transmission and distribution is an area of increasing investment. This graph here shows over time the amount of investment utilities have been making since 1994. In particular, you see that distribution and transmission investment have grown significantly. And there's a lot of legitimate reasons why we're seeing such significant growth in the transmission and distribution capital. We've got a very old and aging grid. We've got a need to modernize the grid to be able to allow utilities to more flexibly manage load. And then also we've seen a trend of utilities making some less than cost-effective investments in local transmission in ways that, are probably less desirable than thinking more regionally as we're planning our transmission grid. And so I wanted to take a quick pause and think, well, what does this look like in utilities? So for the sake of illustrating what that looks like, I wanted to share a look at the past 2 decades of spending for Kentucky Utilities Company to unpack the areas of spending that might be increasing the most. So the largest category of spending in Kentucky for Kentucky Utilities between the period of 2003 and 2023 was generation. CapEx varied significantly during this period, with several years of large investment spikes and drops. And generation OpEx saw spikes, but was more muted, more consistent. Pardon me. Transmission CapEx spending grew at an average annual growth rate of around 7.2%. And distribution CapEx grew less quickly, but still markedly at a compound annual growth rate of 2.2%, even though annual spending since 2018 on these two categories has been relatively similar. So nationally, that was a look backwards. But nationally, what we know is we're anticipating that investment in transmission and distribution infrastructure is going to increase relative to what it has been already to replace existing assets, add and expand the grid's capacity, harden the system to increase its resilience, among other things. And this chart on the bottom shows a breakdown of how utilities are anticipating the different areas of spending that they're going to be making in the transmission and distribution infrastructure. I also wanted to take a step back and think about the relationship between planning and rate making. There are a growing number of planning efforts emerging where we're thinking about the grid of the future, from distribution planning to resilience planning to grid modernization planning. And it's really essential that all of these planning efforts are coordinated and can feed into one another to ensure that assumptions are consistent and to lower the risk that utilities will overbuild for the future or to underbuild. Pardon me. We've also found in our work that there are many states that don't have a clear way to ensure that the investments that the utilities are identifying in their planning efforts are showing up in the rate cases or other relevant dockets that are approving cost recovery. And so it's really important to think about opportunities for standardization or requirements for how utilities are justifying their investments in these proceedings and making a linkage back to their planning activities. So they're to ensure that they're containing cost effectively. So I want to also talk about some of the perverse incentives, specifically around CapEx bias and gold plating. The return on equity, or ROE, is what a company earns on its capital investments. So for utilities, it's allowed rate of profit is a percentage on that the regulatory process grants the utility the opportunity to earn. And the cost of equity is what the investors actually expect to earn when they make an investment within a stock relative to stocks with comparable or similar levels of risk. And CapEx bias is created by utilities having higher ROEs than what the actual cost of equity really looks like. And so this graph shows that approved ROEs over time, the red dotted line, are consistently in excess of the return that investors can expect from relatively low risk, but not risk-free corporate bonds, which is the blue line across the bottom. Pardon me. And so evidence suggests that ROEs are higher than what they need to be across the country. And one of the ways this manifests is by increasing bills for ratepayers. And so nationally, a look across the country, a 1% lower ROE could reduce bills by $2.33 per month for the average ratepayer. And so what that looks like is almost $30 per year in savings. And that's just from a 1% reduction in ROE. So there's lots of opportunity here to think about reducing the utilities ROE to ensure that to minimize the CapEx bias incentive and to reduce costs for ratepayers. Another way in which perverse incentives are showing up, such as CapEx bias and gold plating, is through cost trackers. Cost tracker is a mechanism that is designed to expedite utility cost recovery for a particular category of cost. And so when that's applied to capital costs, the effect of the cost tracker is that their CapEx bias and gold plating incentives really go unfettered. And these incentives are typically kept in check by the more traditional rate making process of rate cases. And so it's really important to be careful and considerate about when cost trackers are allowed and designing them well when they are. Then there's the issue of fuel cost pass-through. Fuel costs are passed through to customers 100% traditionally. So any deviances from what is included in base rates as the anticipated cost for fuel is then passed through 100% to ratepayers, which creates a moral hazard in which utilities lack any incentive to guard against the risk of fuel costs increasing and becoming more volatile because they are protected or insulated from the consequences of increasing fuel cost volatility. Whereas ratepayers, on the other hand, have no control and bear all of the risk. So this is really systematic impacts in terms of suppressing renewable energy, in terms of the utilities' decision making. It's unfair for other industries that rely on gas because electric utilities are such big customers in that industry, and them being price takers sort of increases the cost for everyone else. And it increases the cost particularly unfairly or unequitably for low-income customers. And then across proceedings, what we're noticing is that there's information asymmetry, which makes it difficult for regulators to be certain that utilities have made prudent decisions. And commissions across the US are considering ways to increase transparency by requiring stakeholders to share more data And they're designing regulatory processes for more robust stakeholder engagement, requiring public reporting on a greater number of data points for key areas of utility performance, like CapEx and operational spending trends, metrics for affordability, metrics for disconnection, et cetera.
Mm.
So now I'm going to talk quickly about some reforms to advance affordability. When we think about reducing cost, one of the straightforward ways to do that is to ensure that the return on equity, the utility's authorized return on equity, is set at a level that is fair. And so there are several ways to do that that involve adjusting the practices used to determine the utility's authorized return on equity to more closely align with the utility's true cost of capital or true cost of equity and reduce the share of equity that's in the utility's capital structure. Pardon me. I'm recovering from a cold, so apologies, everyone. So I won't talk about each of the specific options here, but ultimately, it's really important to think about if there are ways to set the utilities ROE or reforms in the ways that utilities authorized ROE is determined, which can more accurately reflect the utility's business risk in that jurisdiction and contribute less to this increasing divide between authorized ROEs and what the true cost of equity really is to save ratepayers money. There's also there's also opportunity to reform the way that capital cost trackers are used to mitigate capital bias. Ultimately, the industry can mitigate the risk. Ultimately, the industry can mitigate the risk that cost trackers pose by limiting the use to cases in which they are clearly needed and by taking steps to encourage cost-efficient spending. And so what does this look like? Efforts to calculate and understand the current and historical context of how much utility revenues have flowed through cost trackers can be really helpful first step. And then once the scale of the problem is understood, criteria for cost tracker usage or merging cost trackers into base rates and adopting and complementary cost efficiency mechanisms can help control cost. I'm going to skip forward just in the interest of time, but folks will have access to all of my slides after this presentation. And so I'm happy to answer any questions on content that I'm not presenting on today. So in terms of addressing the issue of the moral hazard of fuel cost being 100% passed through to customers, there is a tool called fuel cost risk sharing, which gives the utility some stake in the game so that they are motivated to reduce the total fuel cost expenditures. And it works by giving the utility a portion, pardon me, a portion of the savings if the utility's fuel costs are under budget. But if the fuel costs are over budget, then the utility's investors pay for a portion of the overspend. And it's my understanding that gas utilities in Kentucky have voluntary fuel cost sharing mechanisms, but I don't believe there are any for electric utilities. And as you can see in this map, several states, including Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, all use fuel cost risk sharing for electric utilities. So it's an opportunity to explore further. So the policies and reforms I've spoken to about so far have been focused on reducing the total size of the pie. But many customers cannot afford the current size of the pie, right? And even with more effective utility cost containment, the size of the pie is still likely to grow given some of the triangle of trends and factors that I noted earlier. So as such, it can be helpful to think about the other tools that can directly help low-income households to manage the increasing costs they're going to be seeing. Low-income rates are a special discounted rate for households based on their household income, and there are about 12 states across the country that employ low-income discount rates. Percentage of income payment plans cap bills as a percentage of the household income. And Carmen is going to talk to you a little bit more in just a minute about her experience with PIP in Virginia. Disconnection reform can prevent disconnections from occurring in times of extreme heat or extreme cold. They may also include eliminating financial penalties for disconnection and reconnection. And then finally, arrearage management plans provide leniency for ratepayers who are struggling to pay their bills, and in some cases can be associated with debt forgiveness. And I want to call out that each of these reforms can reduce utility overall bad debt, which in turn reduces total cost for all ratepayers. And so in many cases, these reforms are actually cost effective for all ratepayers, not just low-income customers. And then another reform I want to talk about is targeting energy efficiency measures at low-income customers, which many states do and can be particularly effective at reducing high energy burden for customers. And many states do this, as I said, but there's still so much more room for improvement. And as you can see, some of the states that have the greatest opportunity for improvement are here in the Southeast, and that includes Kentucky. Even something as simple as working to pardon me, as working to establish a low-income rate class can be helpful in ensuring that the most vulnerable customers aren't paying more than their fair share of the total pie through regressive cross-subsidization of certain utility investments. So I'm going to conclude here with just a suggestion to check out RMI's Energy Poverty Policy Simulator. This is a really awesome tool to help understand what is the total cost of implementing one of the latter reforms focused on low-income customers. What is the total cost of that program, and what would the impact be on other customers of the utility if such a program were to be implemented? So I'm going to stop there and turn it over now to Carmen to talk about Virginia Poverty Law Center's work advancing PIP in Virginia.
Thank you, Janelle, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with you our experiences here in Virginia. Again, my name is Carmen Bingham. I am the Affordable Clean Energy Program Director here at the Virginia Poverty Law Center. We're based out of Richmond, but we are a statewide organization. We are part of our legal aid system here in Virginia. We are the policy advocate and education center for our legal aid attorneys. So Janelle, let's go ahead to the next slide. I only have one slide, and this is pretty much it. I just wanted to have a conversation about kind of how we got into this space at Virginia Poverty Law Center, leading up into our development. We actually were the architect of the PIP program here in Virginia that did get put into legislation in 2020, which passed and has recently been able to be, we've had our first year of implementation now, having started in 2024, and our first year, we're now in the cases for the true ups for 2020 for Dominion and APCO. So first, let me just say that Virginia Poverty Law Center, we worked in consumer protection since our inception in 1978, but specifically we're working on payday loans, and we had a payday helpline. And in learning from our constituency that called our payday helpline, we realized that people weren't using payday loans for emergencies. More and more of them, and as a matter of fact, we got to the point where we did a survey, and about 67% of our callers were using payday loans to pay for their electric utility bill. And that is not what payday lenders told us payday loans were going to be used for. And that is not really what individuals should be using payday loans for, because these are not emergency costs. These are ongoing recurring bills that people receive every month. So if you take out a loan to pay for one month, it just adds to that downward spiral into poverty for a lot of households. And so we decided that we needed to actually look at what is causing the increase of utility bills in Virginia. And keep in mind, this was a two-person team, myself and my director, Dana Wiggins. And neither one of us are attorneys. Neither one of us have any experience in the utility world other than my legislative background and understanding some of the legislation that was being passed. But even then, it was so complicated that the bits and pieces that I was able to learn never got put together as a full puzzle. So in 2016, Virginia Poverty Law Center was awarded a grant to allow us to start this program. And we started working with a lot of partners in this area, one of which was a gentleman by the name of Will Reisinger, who worked for a law firm, Green Herlocker. Will also had been a regulatory attorney within our state's attorney general's office, and he developed this guide to electric utility regulation in Virginia, seriously to help us understand how this all came about. But we use it as a guide for our legislators and policymakers here in Virginia to help them understand how rate making actually works and how it was developed in Virginia. Through the years, we realized much of what Janelle was talking about, the CapEx bias, the gold plating, um, peer reviews on ROEs, all of that was built into our rate making policies and legislation in Virginia. And so we began with partners to start to take that apart. In the same track, while we were doing this, we were also working to um, basically try to get more implementation of energy efficiency programs, specifically for our constituency, the low income households in Virginia, and improve those programs that were already in place. But there was still much work to work on, many things to work on, because we were still finding that people calling our payday helpline were still using payday loans to pay for these increasing utility bills. In 2020, Virginia passed legislation called the Clean Economy Act. It was one of the first ones in the South to actually require utilities to transition to clean energy as part of their generation, and to set targets for that generation. As part of that legislation, the percentage of income payment plan that I specifically had designed for Virginia was included in that as part of the negotiations in order to get that legislation passed, because we recognized that there needed to be a tool in there to have for low income people as we went through this transition. Now, as I developed this, all of this, like I said, this legislation was brought forth in 2020, just ahead of the pandemic, right? I had done a lot of research on Ohio's program, Illinois' program, and then some of the utilities out in California also have forms of a percentage income payment plan. I looked at these specifically because of three things that they had. One was the actual percentage of income. So it was based on what people made, right? What their income was, so that we could tie that specifically to that income so they wouldn't have to pay anything else. The second was they also looked at reducing the energy usage of those households. Um, Ohio specifically looks at, they couple their PIP program with an energy efficiency program. And so we wanted to make sure we could do that. And the third thing was something that I took from a program that was built. It's one of the utilities out in California that uses it, but it's an arrearage forgiveness program. So for every payment that an individual makes on time and in full, 1/12 of their arrearage is forgiven. And so that way they can start building against their, paying down that arrearage while also still being able to afford their monthly utility bill. Now, the good thing in Virginia is that, first of all, we implemented this just in our two big IOUs, Dominion Energy and APCO. We have a third IOU that is a subsidy of Old Kentucky Utilities called Old Dominion Utility. It operates down in 4 counties in the very southwest tip of Virginia. and they have about 30,000 customers there. We did not require them to use a PIP because of just the small size of their customer base there. But if we can get a PIP in Kentucky for the rest of Kentuckians, then we can get a PIP in Virginia for the OGP portion of Kentucky utilities. But anyway, I digress. The As we were going into the pandemic, we recognized we did implement a moratorium. Our utilities did the "oh woe is me," but we were forward thinking in some of our collaborators across the country, looking at, well, what happens when this moratorium is gone? And so while we knew we had the PIP, what we also had to look at was what kind of assistance, what kind of programs could we have for those people who are not in PIP on their arrearages that are going to accumulate during the pandemic. Well, as Janelle pointed out, the information asymmetry that happens is that the utility has all the information and we have nothing. For years, we've been fighting to get that information through our regulatory process, and finally, the pandemic offered us that opportunity. So we were able to get, due to the pandemic, the residential disconnection information both on a monthly and annual basis, the aggregated usage and aggregated arrearage and usage data, again, monthly and annually. We have the LAHEAP bill assistance, access to the LAHEAP bill assistance recipients in terms of aggregated amounts, and in working with our Department of Social Services, which is the organization that actually operates the PIP program here in Virginia, they're able to see who the LAHEAP recipients are, how much bill assistance they get, whether or not they're repeat users of LAHEAP. So we do get that information. And we also know, because our weatherization and utility energy efficiency programs, which are by far the largest and broadest energy efficiency utility programs for low-income people right now in Virginia, are both implemented by what we refer to as our weatherization provider network here in Virginia. So we have all of that information. However, again, as I said, this legislation was implemented in 2020. It was passed during the 2020 session, which is January, February, went into effect July 1st. Immediately, they started to work, the utilities and DSS started to work on implementing this program. We had a stakeholder process. We had hoped within a year we would have this all set and up and running for people, but it took until 2024 before the first people were enrolled in the program because of things we didn't know. We didn't know who to market. Well, we knew who to market it to because we started with LAHEAP, but we didn't know where they were. While DSS has the backdoor access to the customer accounts, they can't see where the people are. So we didn't know exactly where everybody was. We didn't have data on what the chronic arrearages were, whether it was, whether that be on a monthly basis or an annual basis, but which accounts were chronically held in arrearage. We also didn't have the information on chronic disconnections. How many people actually would get disconnected and then get reconnected, get disconnected and get reconnected? How often was this happening? How often were people being threatened with disconnection, but then scraped up enough to keep themselves from getting disconnected that month, but then the next quarter or the next month had to do the exact same thing? We don't have any of that information. We also didn't have information about the utilities customer service platform. At this particular time, Dominion was also undergoing a revamp of their customer service platform because they've been working with they like to say 1990, I like to say 1960 technology, where they could not give us this data in such a granular level that we really needed in order to see it. But they decided to design their own customer service platform, and they did so based on what they felt they needed, not necessarily what the regulators needed in order to help customers either access programs that could be available to them later, or just to provide helpful data to the utility, but also to the utility and their partners as they're looking at affordability and addressing that issue for their customers. And then we also
Carmen, sorry to interrupt, just a quick time check.
Sure, sorry.
We've got 2 minutes until the 50-minute mark, and maybe want to leave the last 10 minutes for Q&A with the
Sure.
audience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So then this was the list of what we knew and then what we didn't know and things that we needed to know. And these are things that regulators can ask for. And I would encourage everybody to do that, because the more you know, the more information you have, the better you can be prepared and the better you can uh, design the programs that can meet the needs of your utility customers. And that's it. So yeah.
Wow, thank you so much, Carmen, and another big thanks to Janelle as well for your presentations today. For folks who are interested, our next webinar will be October 6th at the same time, and it'll be about building resources fast, how we can use DERs and distributed generation. So thanks again for coming, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.